Kitco News special coverage of FreedomFest is brought to you by I Trust Capital.
Hello, you're watching Kitco News, and I'm Michelle Makori, coming to you from FreedomFest 2021 in Rapid City, South Dakota. The Biden administration's so-called infrastructure bill hitting another snag. Senate Republicans voting against starting to debate a $1.2 trillion version of the bill. They say they want more time to actually write the legislation and to strike a better deal with Democrats. Well, my next guest says that the Biden administration's infrastructure bill and Build Back Better plan will in fact reverse, not advance, American interests. Tim Phillips is the president of Americans for Prosperity, and I'm glad to have him joining us.
Absolutely.
Today.
Good to see you, Michelle.
All right, so Tim, you're campaigning to stop Washington waste, as you call it, and advocating against the infrastructure bill. Break down for us what it is you're opposed to.
The federal government has spent just over $6 trillion, or appropriated just over $6 million since last March of 2020 during this pandemic. Now, some of that money was needed to get through a very difficult period for the country, but so much of it was simply sheer wasteful spending. We're already seeing inflation skyrocketing in this country, and so spending another $3.5 to $4 trillion would further drive up inflation, and it would really go more toward ideological wish list projects rather than roads and bridges that they claim it would go toward.
Well, a version of the bill does include traditional infrastructure, if you will, because now it seems as though the term infrastructure is being applied across the board very loosely. But some of it does tackle roads, bridges, internet. So how do you advance that aspect of the bill? You could argue that perhaps it is better to strike some kind of bipartisan deal rather than leave it to the Democrats with some kind of reconciliation package.
Well, there is a package, the bipartisan bill, about a dozen Republicans working with some Democrats there, that would be a roughly somewhere between $600 billion and $1.1 trillion. And a percentage of that, probably half or so, would be traditional roads, bridges, et cetera. But there would be so much additional waste and unrelated transportation projects in that bill that is still bad policy. They would be far better off to take some of the money that's already been appropriated in that $6 trillion plus over the last year and actually reallocate it toward the core function of roads and bridges. There's a chunk of it unspent. In fact, there's been coverage over the last week. About a half a dozen states have been using some of that unspent money to give teachers unions bonuses. Well, that's the kind of spending that drives Americans nuts when it could go to a core function like roads and bridges. So they should take some of that money and reallocate it rather than appropriating brand new dollars.
Democrats would argue that a bill like this will inject the economy with more jobs, with more opportunity, that essentially inflation isn't a concern because it will create increased demand and create more jobs again and better company infrastructure. What do you say to that?
That's an old, tired cliche, literally going back decades now. It is ironic to hear President Biden make that claim. He was the vice president in 2009 when the first original almost $1 trillion stimulus bill was kicked in. They promised, and this was their quote, shovel-ready jobs by the tens of thousands. It didn't work. Then Vice President Biden had to ruefully admit that in fact the jobs were not as shovel-ready as he and President Obama had thought. So we've heard that before. Simply having government pick winners and losers with our taxpayer dollars, that's not really freedom. And certainly it does not lead to prosperity. So it's a bad idea. And again, the inflation pop that we're seeing right now, it's deeply worrisome because when you have overheated spending, which we clearly have had over the last year, we see what it does to prices. Everything from gasoline to food to travel to plywood to core commodities, they're going through the roof right now. And that hurts Americans at the margins. Senior citizens on fixed incomes, that single mom struggling to make it on $30,000 or $40,000 a year, that's who gets hurt by inflation. And all this overheated spending is going to lead to more of that.
So Democrats on the left say that whatever version is being discussed doesn't go far enough when it comes to social welfare programs. Senator Bernie Sanders, for example, would like there to be a path to citizenship for illegal immigrants somehow worked into this whole package. This leads the thinking that the likes of Senator Joe Manchin, the more centrist Democrats, if you will, and Kristen Sinema may object and oppose a reconciliation version of this bill. How do you see it playing out? Have you had traction with targeting them? How do you see this actually playing out at this point?
We have, the extreme left, the socialist left that Bernie Sanders and Sheldon Whitehouse and other senators represent are pushing for a partisan infrastructure bill that will use the reconciliation process, which circumvents the 60 vote requirement in the Senate. And you do have about a half a dozen kind of center left or moderate Democrats. And we're prioritizing them. So we're in their states at Americans for Prosperity. We have full-time staff, community organizers, activists there. And we're urging both senators in Arizona, Sinema, who you mentioned, also Kelly, Maggie Hassan from New Hampshire, Senator Cortez Masto from Nevada, Joe Manchin in West Virginia, and then John Tester in Montana. And our message in those states is, please, senators, don't go along with this extreme agenda from the far left, especially if you're trying to circumvent the rules of the Senate that require 60 votes to move forward. And I can tell you at Americans for Prosperity, we actually favor immigration reform. Our nation needs it. We haven't really done a comprehensive immigration effort in about 3 decades. And so we need to do that. But the way to do that is not to try to jam it through in a $4 trillion catch-all ideological wish list. It's to do it through the regular Senate process to build common ground. I think it's there on some core elements of immigration reform and follow the rules that are clearly laid out in the U.S. Senate.
We'll tackle immigration another time. That's a whole conversation on its own. But back to the infrastructure bill and the spending that will require. You're going to have to pay for it somehow. Right. And to do that, Democrats are suggesting raising taxes. They want to raise corporate taxes. They want to tax people making over $400,000 households, which in a city like New York really isn't that much. Maybe it goes far in Rapid City, but doesn't go that far in New York City. And of course, they also want to raise capital gains taxes. If that does happen, what impact will that have on the economy?
It'll be one of the most devastating consequences of this legislation, and that's saying something given how bad it is. The 2017 tax reform that then President Trump and the Republican Congress pushed through was a game changer. Dropping that corporate rate from 35, one of the highest in the developed world, to 21. And American businesses are trying to come out of this pandemic and grow and get their strength back. That's the worst time to drive their tax rates back up to 25 or 28%. And so we would urge the Congress not to do that. It's a terrible time to do that. Also, they're talking about a carbon border tax now. You've probably seen that, putting that in the bill, which would say, okay, if your nation does not meet our environmental standards, we're going to tax anything coming, from you into the country. What is that going to do? It's going to drive up prices for American consumers. And who does that hit? Again, those struggling at the margins, young people, single moms and senior citizens. So many of the proposals from the socialist left, ironically, they hurt working folks and the people struggling the most, which is an irony given the ideology of the socialism movement.
So the Biden administration does recognize that raising the corporate tax rate will make America uncompetitive on the global stage. And to counter that, they have been advocating very ferociously for a minimum global corporate tax rate. Treasury Secretary Yellen making some traction on that front. There does seem to be G20 support, and they are going to reach some consensus in a meeting in Rome, I believe, in September. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, international bodies that are working and attempting to lock in corporate tax rates or any kind of tax rates for individual countries. What a loss of freedom for the people in those individual countries. It's this idea from a lot of elites that we know best. So from the top, we're going to press down to the little people, the rules that are best for them to live by. And it's an elitist idea that is not new, but it has taken on a stronger hue under this administration, and it's a terrible idea. Let each country decide.
Can that happen, Tim, though? Can a minimum global corporate tax rate happen without Congress getting involved? I mean, isn't it a treaty on some level?
Well, that would have to be considered a treaty, and that means the U.S. Senate would have to ratify and I don't think there would be support for any such thing. However, the Paris Climate Treaty, which was a treaty originally, was signed by Obama. The Senate was clearly going to reject it, so he made it into an accord, which is the same thing as a treaty. You just call it an accord.
Semantics.
It was, and so he did it unilaterally, which gets dangerously close to the American executive branch being imperial, which is not something that's good for the country. And so I would certainly hope and expect that any such treaty would be treated as a treaty, and therefore the U.S. Senate would have to act to ratify it before it would take effect. But there has been troubling precedent with this Paris Climate Accord and with the Iranian nuclear agreement as well, which again was not ratified by the United States Senate.
Well, perhaps that's another cause for Americans for prosperity, but you are highlighting another bill which has actually flown under the radar, and that's the PRO Act, which goes to disincentivize, or rather disenfranchise, many independent freelance contract workers. What are your issues with the PRO Act?
Well, the PRO Act would be the greatest erosion of freedom for individual American workers probably in a century. It would eliminate right-to-work laws in 27 states, which protect Americans in those 27 states from having to be forced to join a union as a condition of employment. It would also eliminate the secret ballot in a union organizing election at a place of work. The secret ballot is such an important personal protection for people. As you said, it would effectively end the gig economy. I take Uber all over the country or Lyft all over the country. The number one thing the drivers tell me, and I hear this all the time, I have freedom. I can choose to work this day, I can not choose to work this day. No one can tell me what to do. I have that freedom. It would take that away.
How does it do that? How does it take that away?
It eliminates, if you are choosing to associate with a company, whether it's Uber, Lyft, or whether it's any other, if you have a truck and you want to do freelance work hauling produce for a local company, a grocery store chain, it says no. You have to be an employee. And so you lose that freedom because it locks you into being an employee, and it's draconian and sweeping in its nature. Again, imagine that you're an Uber driver and you're being told, right, well, if you're going to do this work, you have to be an employee.
Well, what does it mean for companies? Because if companies have employees as opposed to freelancers, they have other commitments to those employees, potentially to provide benefits and such.
Yeah, it radically changes the operating model, because they built their companies based on the premise that these folks are freelance choice contractors. No one says to them, traditionally, government would look at an employer as someone who dictated the terms of employment to the employee, right? Yeah. Here are the hours, here are the days, etc. These companies don't do that. They say, we want a free association. And that works far better in this current environment because it lets people choose what to do, and it gives freedom to individual Americans. And if those Americans want to work to unionize as contractors, as freelance, let them. That's not a bad thing to do either.
And on the union front, what does the bill call for there?
Well, the union front, it would give more targets of opportunity for organizing to labor unions, which are a key ally of the Democrats. So if Uber has to suddenly hire 1 million people, that's a brand new pool of employees that unions can go after. So it gives them a pool of people. Also, by eliminating right-to-work laws in 27 states, suddenly they have targets of opportunity right now where people have to join a union as a condition of employment in places like Texas, Florida, Arizona, fast-growing, very prosperous states that suddenly have far more potential union members.
And where does this legislation stand at the moment? It's passed the House?
It passed the House very quietly back in the spring, by the way, without any committee hearings. Speaker Pelosi jammed it through by going to a committee of the whole. So she subverted the own process to avoid public coverage of this. And now it sits in the Senate. And if they're able to kill the filibuster in the Senate, if Schumer's able to do that, this thing would have a shot in the United States Senate of getting 50 votes.
All right, Tim, give us some good news now. Americans for Prosperity, how can Americans still pursue prosperity, capitalism, liberty, the American dream?
Here's the good news. At the state level, in states that allow freedom and with their rules and laws, you have enormous prosperity right now. Texas, Florida, Arizona just cut taxes down to 2.5% flat rate. I was just in Florida last week. It's booming. And when you look at states like New York and California and Illinois, it's heartbreaking to see them trailing so far behind, with unemployment higher, with business failures higher. And it's because of their policies, and Americans, like never before, are voting with their feet. California actually had a net loss in population, which would be unthinkable in the past, but they do because of their policies. And so the good news is we do have some remaining federalism, which lets individual states set their own policies. Florida has no income tax. Texas has no state income tax. And Americans in a more mobile age are choosing freedom and prosperity. That's exciting. The other thing is this: despite these horrific policies being proposed in Washington, the actual margin philosophically in Washington is razor thin, the closest in decades. It's 50-50 in the Senate. It's only about a 7-vote spread in the House of Representatives. So it's fascinating that these majorities in Congress right now that are the closest in generations, okay, are trying so hard to move the country toward an authoritarian socialist side with that narrow margin. So there is good news for a lot of Americans. It's a challenging time. And in all candor, it's a bit frightening. Some of the attempts to silence free speech that we're seeing. We just had a big Supreme Court victory, Americans for Prosperity Foundation, where the Attorney General of California at the time, a lady named Kamala Harris, you may have heard of her.
I think name rings a bell.
They attempted to bully us into disclosing all of our donors, which would have led to harassment and intimidation. We took that case all the way to the Supreme Court, and about 4 weeks ago, we won 6-3. So the protection, the First Amendment rights of anonymous speech is still there. And I do think that this period of turbulence is causing a lot of Americans to consider the very nature of individual liberty, because they can look at a state like Michigan, draconian lockdowns, and what it leads to with the crushed businesses and with genuine failures across the board, while the governor there hypocritically ignores her own mandates and flies to Florida. They can compare that record to a Texas or a Florida. So I am encouraged. I think this is a challenging moment for the country, but I do see hope in the future.
Well, we will leave it on that hopeful, optimistic note. Thank you so much for joining us here on Kitco News. Tim Phillips, President for Americans for Prosperity. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Michelle.
Kitco News special coverage of Freedom Fest is brought to you by I Trust Capital.